the day, drawing stares from the ground below. Then it let loose. And the sound carried for miles. Until now, the bombs have fallen just one or two at a time on the front lines. Today, there were at least 30 explosions in the span of an hour. Then fighter-bombers took over, picking off Taliban tanks and anti-aircraft artillery one by one. Opposition forces tell ABC News 4 tanks and 6 heavy guns suffered direct hits. As the sound of the bombs echoed in the distance, elite soldiers in the Northern Alliance Army, the Zarbati, were conducting assault drills and receiving a lecture from the senior general in this part of Afghanistan. When you enter Kabul, you must not do anything that would make a bad impression, Bismillah Khan told the troops. The world will be watching. David Wright, ABC News, Rabat, Afghanistan.
A tour with one overriding goal: to make their case that indiscriminate U.S. bombing has killed hundreds of civilians. They say this house, a medical clinic, was hit this morning, killing 15, injuring more than 20. The chief doctor says the U.S. is targeting civilians. He now wants to fight the Americans. Many of the reporters on the tour were skeptical. There was no way to confirm the number of casualties we were given, and we weren't taken to a hospital to see the injured. Also today, the Taliban provided access to top government officials, including the foreign minister. There had been widespread reports that he had defected. Taliban also arranged a rare interview with a high-ranking military officer, Akhtan Muhammad Usmani. He said the airstrikes have unified the Taliban and that only 15 of his men had been killed. He and his soldiers came to this local madrasa, or religious school, for the interview. They said conducting it at the military headquarters would have made us targets for airstrikes. They were probably right. These are people the U.S. wants eliminated.
Days to go, Secret Service agents are already inspecting the site. On Main Street in Park City, surveillance cameras monitor pedestrians. And for the first time ever, metal detectors at the Mormon Church. A record 7,000 law enforcement agents are already training for counterterrorism. Today, organizers said the games will be safe and will go on.
There is no backup plan for a delay or anything else in the games. They will happen. They'll begin on February 8th, 2002.
That's why the government has closed off the airspace around all plant sites. Some states have called in the National Guard and the Coast Guard. But several watchdog groups and members of Congress say more must be done. They call for full-time Army details and anti-aircraft guns like the ones the French have recently added at their nuclear fuel facilities. Nobody has ever died from radiation at a U.S. nuclear plant. There's been nothing like the Soviet disaster at Chernobyl. But some people say a terrorist attack here could release far more radiation. Ned Potter, ABC News, New York.
That the U.S. bombed yesterday. They are now under 24-hour surveillance, sources say, from the air and ground. When U.S. Special Operations troops made their highly advertised raids 2 weeks ago, taking an airfield and Taliban command post, sources tell ABC News it was in part a diversion, so other teams could be dropped off to begin intensified surveillance in the mountains nearby. The Bush administration is now debating whether to go after bin Laden by using giant 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs or to send in commandos. Bombing has lower risk for American troops, of course, but if successful, there might never be proof the job was done. For that reason, Pentagon sources say the scales have tilted toward going after bin Laden with troops. John Hillen was in Special Operations for 6 years. Sources tell ABC News that bombs are already being used against some of these caves, but only for limited tactical purposes, to seal off some of the entrances, limiting the ways al-Qaeda members can get out, and, in the words of one source, to shake the anthill, hitting near the entrance, then watching activity that follows. Intelligence sources say the number of fighters now protecting bin Laden appears to be growing, increasing the risk to U.S. troops.
Our special operation, an hour north of Kandahar, to see what one called the real face of the U.S. Army, Chokar Korez, a village dismantled in a bombardment 10 days ago. An attack witnessed by a local shepherd. Nobody was able to escape, he said. They were all trapped. It's tough to get an exact number, but based on interviews with people who live in the area, it appears around 50 people died here. If this was a Taliban or Al-Qaeda base, there were no signs amid the rubble, only remnants of household life and pieces of exploded bombs. In a neighboring village, the brother of one victim walked through fresh graves, yelling out the names of the dead. Only God knows why they attacked us, he said. Today, the Pentagon said it did hit the village and hit it on purpose. They called it a Taliban encampment with many Al-Qaeda collaborators. No matter what the truth is, the Taliban are clearly making this attack one of the highlights of our visit. After the trip to Chokar Kharez, we had a chance to deviate from the Taliban's agenda with a foray into downtown Kandahar. What we saw was a city that was neither abandoned nor in a state of panic. Stocked stores, afternoon traffic, and curiosity about an American visitor. We had been out of the car for about 30 seconds when we were surrounded by people who wanted to shake hands, talk, or just stare. Dan Harris, ABC News, Kandahar.
Republican John McCain pleaded with members to hear their argument that security by low-paid private airport screeners led to the tragedy of September 11th.
This is police work. The companies that have been doing this have failed the American people.
Shame on anyone who says that union workers or government workers can't be trusted. I'll tell you who can't be trusted. The companies who will cut every corner to save a dime so they can come in with the lowest bid.
Since charged the Democrats' plan just means more big government.
You can go home and tell your constituents. What we did is created the biggest bureaucracy in the history of a generation.
Democrats accused Republicans of trying to preserve the status quo.
Worker might have led them to the anthrax terrorists. That maybe Kathy Nguyen was exposed because the people behind the attacks were in her neighborhood. But extensive tests at her workplace, at her apartment, on her mail, and her clothes all proved negative.
We did do environmental sampling.
In New Jersey, where the anthrax letters were mailed, no hard lead.
Those bridges were built.
To counter that threat, the Coast Guard has deployed a first-of-its-kind unit called the Sea Marshals, more than 20 teams of armed and specially trained men and women. All along the West Coast, ports are on heightened alert. In Long Beach, that means closer inspection of cargo containers being offloaded from foreign ships. 7,400 containers come into Long Beach every day.
Many fleeing persecution, torture, and death. But the U.S. has now shut its doors. It is not only traumatic, it is dangerous. Among those waiting to come to the U.S., 400 women escaping Taliban rule in Afghanistan.
Governor's warning of a potential threat?
I think it's a good information.
But health officials say not yet. Not unless they see a case of the disease or credible intelligence that someone's planning a smallpox attack. John McKenzie, ABC News, New York.
Fights broke out when the firefighters pushed through police lines to get to ground zero.
Get out, PD!
New York's fire commissioner at the end of the day said he agrees with the mayor and apologized to the police on behalf of his department. Bill Blakemore, ABC News, New York.
By day, we discovered it's a city that's crowded and vibrant, and with its donkey carts and dirt roads, feels like it's from another age. Kandahar is from the man on the street, and by the way, there are almost no women on the street, to the top brass said no to handing over bin Laden.
In one of Cuba's popular tourist areas.
He claimed the Taliban is already far weaker than it was when the bombing began a month ago. And outgun the opposition, something the U.S. tries to address from the air every day. John McWethy, ABC News, the Pentagon. Set in motion new initiatives that could result in American fighter bombers used
of Kabul. Long lines of soldiers, their commanders, and the president of the Afghan opposition. You're fighting not just for your country, he said, but for all the world. They've been saying that for weeks now, but they still aren't fighting. Today, while American bombs rained down again on the Taliban lines, these soldiers ran another training exercise.
Instead, Rudy's looking like a kingmaker.
Worried because one incident could more than wipe out
young girl's eyes. She was the one I wanted to photograph because she had these very haunting, kind of troubled eyes, which seemed to...
They're seeking chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Given the means, our enemies would be a threat to every nation and eventually to civilization itself.
That, aides say, was a deliberate message designed to reinvigorate world opinion in the war on terrorism. It was also, officials add, based on credible intelligence findings. Today in the Rose Garden with French President Chirac, Mr. Bush pledged an all-out effort to stop bin Laden.
If he doesn't have them, we will work hard to make sure he doesn't. If he does, we'll make sure he doesn't deploy them.
The president's comments.
In 1994, the U.S. flew 1,300 pounds of uranium from Kazakhstan to an American weapons plant. But many more tons remain. Ned Potter, ABC News, New York.
San Francisco would rather rely on something more dependable from now on. Judy Muller, ABC News, San Francisco.
Today we are taking another step in our fight against the evil. We are shutting down two major elements of the terrorist international financial network, both at home and abroad. They present themselves as legitimate businesses, but they skim money from every transaction for the benefit of terrorist organizations.
Former Mujahideen fighters, Afghan refugees, and Muslims fighting in the former Yugoslavia and the Russian Republic of Chechnya. But Treasury officials say millions went to Al-Qaeda to finance terrorism.
And Washington state will now have the highest tobacco taxes in the country. The price of a pack will go to $5.
But others argue the government may have been too generous.
What the government
Send out a dispatch. Along the way, he saw Taliban fighters who he said are highly mobile and are able to communicate between their units. But he also saw plenty of evidence of how difficult it can be to move people and
method of milling corn into flour. Saki Mohammed appears to be in no hurry to march on Kabul. He has his day job to think of. The Northern Alliance is partly a professional army, but mostly a citizen militia. As many as 5,000 soldiers man the front lines north of Kabul, but only a small fraction were trained in war. They are frontline soldiers only.
Doesn't think Mr. Arafat is taking the war on terrorism seriously.
Come and meet those dancing feet.
She wants to be on Broadway. And one day, maybe she will. Just not today.
I could do something from Cats.
That's nice.
Tanks and heavy artillery have been.
As if suddenly energized by the capture of the strategically important crossroads town of Mazar-e-Sharif 2 days ago, the Northern Alliance forces are on the move.
At Ground Zero, the names of the 86 nations that launched. President Bush, making his second trip to the site, signed a large panel listing all those nations. Pakistan's wishes are getting top priority from the administration.
Marking the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
Within seconds, the thundering sound of the Airbus A300 shaking this entire neighborhood. And our 4 homes were destroyed. Rescue workers fought through the thick smoke, searching for survivors.
Rocketing on the ground.
500 people were killed, many of them washed out to sea. Today, rescue workers tried to unbury it.
The first thing that went through my mind is, oh my God, and I just passed a church in which I've been to, I think, 10 funerals.
This morning, as the forces of the Northern Alliance rolled into Kabul, the people took to the streets. including mothers and daughters who haven't shown their faces since September 1996, since the Taliban took Kabul. Zindabad, they shouted, long life. Kabul has been liberated, literally. Everywhere there are signs that life has changed.
Moved with Afghan opposition forces into the city. The Pentagon signaled it would quickly make use of territory taken.
There is no preferential place at the bargaining table. All people will be treated the same.
At the UN today, an effort to form a post-Taliban
set up a new Afghan government.
Good evening from California. It has been hard to get away from New York City since the 11th of September, but finally we have a few days on the road. California, Colorado, and Texas to hear in person about life and issues from other perspectives. Here in San Francisco, terrorism, the war in Afghanistan, and the economy, not always in that order, come up in conversation immediately. It has been another extraordinary day in Afghanistan. The Taliban has abandoned more territory. Life has changed quite dramatically for many thousands of Afghans, and there are even some strong indications tonight that some of the Taliban want to make a deal for Osama bin Laden. And so we're going to start with all that information at the Pentagon. Here's ABC's John McWethy. John?
The city has been terribly damaged, and the living conditions are desperately.
There were so many searing images of Taliban rule. You may remember the destruction earlier this year of the sacred Buddhas at Bamiyan in central Afghanistan. The Taliban destroyed the Buddhas after decreeing that all statues were false idols and therefore an offense to Islam. Well, the Taliban have now left Bamiyan as well, and the BBC's correspondent David Loyne reached there this morning.
Finn was the part.
Good evening again from Northern California, where the war in Afghanistan and its ramifications, political and economic, are the main news every day for every news organization here. The fighting in Afghanistan is not over, though the U.S. air campaign is much reduced. The Taliban is still hanging on in parts of the country, including the city of Kandahar in the south. The capital, Kabul, is firmly under the control of the Northern Alliance. In fact, there was pressure from Pakistan today to get a multinational force into the country before the Northern Alliance decides unilaterally that it is in charge. More American soldiers are being inserted today. They are after the Taliban leadership and, of course, Osama bin Laden. So we're going to begin at the Pentagon tonight with ABC's John McWethy. John?
United 93, verify 350. The captain, please sit down. Keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb aboard. So it's calling Cleveland Center, you're unreadable. Say again slowly. Here's the captain. I would like to order to remain seated. We have a bomb aboard and are going to back to the airport and we have our demand, so please remain quiet. Okay, it's United 93 calling. United 93, understand you have a bomb on board, go ahead. Executive 956, did you understand that transmission? Affirmative, he said there was a bomb on board. United 93, Cleveland, do you still hear the center? United 93, do you still hear Cleveland?
Tomorrow night we're going to go to Southern California and we'll be broadcasting from San Diego. I'm Peter Jennings. That's World News Tonight. Good night from San Francisco. Good evening, everyone, from San Diego. This is the second largest city in California, and because it is a Navy town, very deeply involved and engaged in the Afghanistan campaign. The Pentagon said today the Taliban have now lost control in 2/3 of Afghanistan and may be on the verge of losing the city of Kandahar in the south. The Pentagon also says that one of Osama bin Laden's most important lieutenants has been killed in a U.S. bombing raid. He is Mohammed Atif, who's accused of helping to plan the September 11th attacks. And so we're obviously going to start tonight with our Pentagon correspondent, John McWethy.
And early this morning, most shops and restaurants were closed, but there is concern that the calm
And that is our report on World News Tonight. On Monday, we're going to be in Dallas. I hope you'll join us then, and that you have a good weekend. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night from San Diego.
Today, Secretary of State Colin Powell made clear the U.S.'s position.
If you truly want a representative government that will be respected in the eyes of the world
and that reflects the aspirations of all the Afghan people, you have to include women in this political structure.
People demonstrating against the airstrikes snaked through the city from Hyde Park to Trafalgar.
The purpose of his speech, he said, will be to lay out America's vision of a Mideast settlement. The first step must be the implementation of the Mitchell Plan, he says, drawn up by former U.S. Senator George Mitchell 7 months ago.
No new plans are coming. We have a plan.
The moderate Muslims expressed their anger over the deaths of Afghan civilians.
Good evening from Dallas, our third and last stop on a brief listening tour in the West and Southwest. At the end of the broadcast, we'll hear what Dallas-Fort Worth has to say about the Afghan campaign, the war against terrorism, and life in general. The focus in Afghanistan today is even tighter than it was over the weekend. The fight with the Taliban for the northern city of Kunduz, the response in Kabul to the idea that power must be shared by all Afghans, and the search for Osama bin Laden. The question everywhere, certainly here in Texas, is where is he? Is he still in the country? And if he is still in the country, as Washington says, how hot is the trail and how much room does he have to maneuver?
And thanks to this bill, we have a new commitment to security in the air. And that's good news as Americans travel to celebrate this season.
The Northern Alliance, its equipment and transportation straight out of biblical days, on the front lines with U.S. Special Forces, outfitted for a 21st century war. No matter where they operate, U.S. Special Forces are armed with night vision goggles that light up terrain, specially modified laser-guided weapons that fire more than 600 rounds a minute, and perhaps the most important equipment, the satellite communications pack, to call in U.S. airstrikes after helping the pilots zero in on Taliban targets.
Are you worried at all about terrorism down here?
At the stadium today?
Anywhere.
A little bit, but I think that we're in good hands.
Many of us in the media don't get the same high marks. Can you tell me how the mood is in Dallas these days?
Nobody likes you.
Okay. This man told us our reporting in these days is unpatriotic and cannot help the nation get back to business. And is going to build a new fighter plane in Fort Worth. Just one last note, the Cowboys call themselves America's team, as you know. And in deference to the hospitality we encountered here, we will not mention yesterday's score against Philadelphia. That is our report on World News Tonight. We'll be back in New York tomorrow. I'm Peter Jennings. I hope you have a good evening. Good night from Dallas.
Evil knows no holiday. Evil knows no, doesn't welcome Thanksgiving or Christmas season. And in these extraordinary times, we're taking extraordinary measures.
Extraordinary measures, too, for the upcoming lighting of the national Christmas tree on the Ellipse. Only invited guests who have undergone background checks may attend. Of the Afghan people enjoying their new soon lash out at American targets.
But with strong public support, the president is moving fast to legally clamp down on terror suspects. Critics on the left and some on the right complain the White House is acting dictatorially and not very democratically.
To include women at the meeting, and in Kabul, some women took. Northern Alliance soldiers removed tanks hidden here by the Taliban during the U.S. bombing of the city. Apparently, the Taliban believed the U.S. would not bomb its own property. They were right.
Fiercely and soon. Don Dahler, ABC News, near Kunduz, Afghanistan.
Quest for flags since September 11th that instead of flying 350 a week, they are flying 1,000 a day. The flags must be American-made, and as of Thanksgiving, there are 30,000 requests which cannot be met. The government is looking for more. The flag office on the Hill calls all the interest in Old Glory glorious.
Just over those hills, about 1,500 Taliban troops are around. For a second day, the
7 suicide bomb attacks that left dozens of Israelis dead. As Israel's military congratulated itself on finally getting Hanun. But with 14 Palestinians dead in the last 4 days, good intentions may not be enough. Ariel Sharon has...
While Northern Alliance soldiers fired over the wall. inside this 18th century fortress. The prisoners fired back with rockets.
Meanwhile, the new men in charge here were enjoying the spoils of victory. And
for a fourth congressional seat, Utah had claimed the Census Bureau was wrong when it refused to count thousands of Utah citizens working abroad as Mormon missionaries. But the U.S. Supreme Court today upheld a lower court's decision supporting the Census Bureau.
And urged his fighters never to surrender. There are now 800 Marines in the South, the number growing every day. They are digging in at an airstrip 65 miles from Kandahar. 200 people from the Air Force have just been ordered to...
Among those cashing in on the trend, United Airlines.
And this is London. Abbey Road, to be specific, where the Beatles recorded so many of their records, one of the many places that people, especially baby boomers, gather today to consider the death of George Harrison. There has been no more significant popular singing group than the Beatles, and today, when people learned that Harrison, who was only 58, had died of cancer, even though they knew he was sick, there was so much history to consider.
Paul McCartney said today he was devastated by the news.
Very brave man, and I'm just privileged to have known him, and I love him like he's my brother. It was a very sad day for me and for a lot of other people.
As rescue teams raced to treat those victims, another bomb went off. This one in a car. The toll here so far, 10 Israelis dead, more than 200 injured. Hamas called the attacks
President Bush called the terrorist strikes acts of murder and put sharp pressure on Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat to act immediately.
Chairman Arafat must do everything in his power to find those who murdered innocent Israelis and bring them to justice.
The president met for more than an hour with Israeli Prime Minister Sharon in the Oval Office. But in a notable shift, there were no public calls from the president or other U.S. officials for Israeli restraint.
It is up to the Prime Minister of Israel.
Have eroded Arafat's power.
His ability to exercise his power.
Congress, though, had a different idea, recently passing bills that would block Bristol from getting a 3-year patent extension.
Balanced by gyroscopes and microprocessors that the rider is as comfortable as standing.
For its part, Israel's government says it's not out to destroy Mr. Arafat.
I think there are some Palestinians that don't want peace. Hamas doesn't want peace. They will do everything they can to destroy a peace process. A peace process, by the way, that was just beginning to mature and nurture and develop. There is no way that Israel can negotiate a peace process so long as its country is being terrorized.
Is Arafat, Yasser Arafat, interested in peace?
That's what we're about to find out. It's now time for Mr. Arafat to prove whether or not he is for peace. And the way he can do that is to aggressively rout out those who would derail the peace process by murdering innocent Israelis. He must show that behind his words of peace there is action, because now's the time. We need action. We need somebody to lead. Or else there's not going to be peace.
For amphetamines. Some doctors are prescribing the drug for daytime drowsiness in people with depression, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis.
Into a bloody week-long gun battle, so everyone is wary. Searched the vast Tora Bora cave and tunnel complex near Jalalabad, where they had been meeting stiff resistance.
Lesson for their children and grandchildren.
Yet out of that surprise attack grew a steadfast resolve that made America freedom's defender. And that mission, our great calling, continues to this hour.
Moral terms of his father's generation.
The terrorists are the heirs to fascism. They have the same will to power, the same disdain for the individual, the same mad global ambitions, and they will be dealt with in just the same way.
The Afghan fighter received a 21-gun salute.
The hunt is also intensifying for Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar.
These men, wearing the trademark black turbans of the Taliban, could they be members of the movement?
The fighting has been fierce. Al-Qaeda
As he's led away, he no doubt fears the worst.
U.S. and its opposition partners give chase.
Terrorism. Not because of the...
We remember the cruelty of the murderers and the pain and anguish of the murdered. Every one of the innocents who died on September the 11th was the most important person on earth to somebody. Every death extinguished a world.
There were reminders in numerous places today that many Americans want, indeed need, to reflect on September the 11th. It was, as we said, 3 months ago today. At Ground Zero in New York City, of course, where the workers pause briefly to consider the horror of it all, a moment of remembrance. At the Pentagon, where the Secretary of Defense had a word about duty and sacrifice.
We will remember their lives and the reason for their deaths until freedom triumphs over oppression, over fear, and long beyond.
In Pennsylvania, the families of those who died in the United flight found some strength in being together again. In many cities across the country, Americans shared a patriotic moment. And overseas, in Britain, a small band from the American School in London played the national anthem outside the Prime Minister's residence. There was a prayer service at the Vatican. A moment of silence in Spain. In Israel and in Russia and in Pakistan and in India, among other places, the sound of the Stars and Stripes could be heard today by many people.
The U.S. B-52 painted a figure 8 in the skies over Tora Bora.
And so many men with so many weapons milling, being a semblance of order.
Officials who have been interviewing Walker at a Marine base in Afghanistan continue to get information about the time he spent with the Taliban.
Afghans with guns, and both will have been lost forever. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Kabul. Looking for fun, looking for trouble, and yet the kids of Kabul are different. 1 in 4 dies before age 5. Half of them are malnourished. And these eyes have seen what no child should ever see.
Bin Laden makes it pretty clear it was his operation. Optimistic, it appears, that the damage at the trade towers would be devastating. The Saudi terrorist says he learned how successful the operation was listening to the radio. Now, the Bush administration says the videotape reveals Mr. bin Laden was actively involved in preparing the September attacks. It certainly appears that way to a lot of people, both here and overseas. John Miller joins us tonight to take us even more deeply into this today. John?
Were a few defiant symbols of what had been before. Sections of the tower's outer shell still standing. Workers have had to pull down those walls so they could safely dig under them. Today they were removing the last of them. But all around were people who hope those walls will stand again.
I want my children.
Thousands of Pakistani army troops are now patrolling the mountain passes, lying in wait, hoping.
To the moon, those of you who wish that the days were a little longer can now cheer up, because even though the sun did set early today, and it did feel like a very short day, the fact is, today is 1/20,000,000th of a second longer than yesterday. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
In the last 2 days, U.S. and Pakistani sources say nearly 300 have been picked up by Pakistani patrols. The U.S. has CIA agents waiting in Pakistan to talk to them.
To the Saudi government made speeches supporting the attacks.
As demonstrators and police clash has been tremendous. The whole center of the city, the downtown area, and the situation just has not calmed down one bit. The people here are suffering from 41 months of economic recession. There's over 20% unemployed in this country. The government is just not responding to the people's calls for measures to reactivate the economy.
Mothers in a sisterhood they didn't choose. Babies connected by a moment they never witnessed. Someone said to her baby, "You are the kiss your father left behind."
Christmas time. Why not? That's what it's all about.
There you go. Okay?
There shouldn't be a child.
As Israeli soldiers.
It's difficult to walk from near them because
today more Palestinians than ever support attacks on Israelis. The siege is a big reason why. Gillian Finley, ABC News in the West Bank.
Firefighters, cops, steel workers, citizens of all backgrounds working and hoping and joining together in crisis. That makes me proud to be a New Yorker, to be an American, to be a human being.
Travelers, he says, will continue to fly as long as they feel safe.
To tell ABC News, Reid is a British national and recently converted to Islam. He's used a number of aliases, including the name Tariq Raja.
You ready to go?
And he can call up 26 different Air Force bases and dispatch fighter aircraft at a moment's notice.
Its military options open.
A brief review of the latest developments today. ABC News has learned there are significant links between Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization and Richard Reid, the man accused of trying to blow up a plane with explosives in his shoes. Law enforcement sources in Europe tell us there is evidence that Reid had contact with Zacarias Moussaoui, who was under arrest in the U.S., accused of being the 20th hijacker on September 11th. And in a new videotape released today, Osama bin Laden calls violence against the U.S. blessed terrorism.
Sitting in tonight, Elizabeth Vargas.
Good evening. Today we heard Osama bin Laden call for the destruction of America and say it will happen if he lives or dies. For the first time, the Arab television network Al Jazeera broadcast the full text of bin Laden's new videotape statement. The hunt for bin Laden continues, and so does wild speculation about his hiding place and his health. ABC's John.
It is here in the heart of the disputed province of Kashmir that two of the world's newest nuclear nations face each other eyeball to eyeball.
It is like a huge dump of explosive, and even a small little ignition can explode everything.
Because both countries know the results of what can happen in a nuclear exchange.
The dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. God bless New York, and God bless America.
I didn't watch it all. I saw snippets of it on TV. You know, it's who knows when it was made. I mean, this is a guy who 3 months ago was in control of a country. Now he's maybe in control of a cave. Tommy will tell you that I haven't said, Tommy, get him tomorrow. I've said, just get him. I talked to the man this morning. I told him how proud I was that he was by my side. If he was treated that way because of his ethnicity, that will make me madder than heck.
That they have gone through hell and survived.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We begin tonight with another look at the Osama bin Laden videotape. When the Bush administration got its hands on the tape, which was found at a house in the Afghan city of Jalalabad, it said it wished to be very careful translating it so that if and when it was released to the public, there would be no opportunity for people to say that it had been doctored, and there is no evidence that it was. But we have learned that there are things missing from the official translation. Whether by omission or because they were politically sensitive, we are not sure. But we also had the tape translated, and there is more there. ABC's John Miller is with us tonight.
India said it plans to camouflage the Taj Mahal to protect it from airstrikes.
This afternoon at Ground Zero in New York City, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani opened an official observation platform where members of the public can watch the ongoing recovery operation at the World Trade Center site. For 28 years. These images were made by an artist working in her studio in the World Trade Center the day before the towers came down. Most Americans probably didn't know those two symbols of button-down finance were also home to more than a dozen artists who shared an unfinished space on the 92nd floor. But that acceptance of the buildings by artists, by critics, and by New Yorkers themselves was a long time in coming.
When the towers were new, I don't think anyone much liked them. They were too big, they were too intrusive. The towers were these big, blocky things, and they threw everything out of scale.
Paul Goldberger, then architecture critic for the New York Times, was scathing in his initial review.
I said they were utterly banal, that they were unworthy of a bank headquarters in Omaha.
Photographer Angelo Lomio was also no fan of the buildings when they were new. But after they were gone, he found he and his wife had taken more than 400 pictures of them.
As we went around photographing New York, you couldn't help but photograph these towers. They were there, you know.
Lomio turned his photos into a book and dedicated it to his wife and collaborator of 50 years, who died a year ago.
As a photographer, I saw the buildings as a challenge in a way because they're not easy buildings to photograph. If you photograph those buildings in flat lighting, they don't look like anything.
But in the right light.
That moment when the sky has that purplish cast, you know, and it's only going to last only a couple of minutes. Each window has its own design. It's incredible. Then at night, of course, it's pure magic. I mean, these are the things that make you grow to have respect for those two towers.
My opinion of the Trade Center mellowed over time. I think everyone's did. Because, of course, we always assumed that they were never going away, and therefore we'd better make a peace with them, so we did. I came to realize over time that the towers did have a gentleness that I hadn't understood or realized at first. There's a kind of softness and shimmering quality to the metal facade and those thin windows and vertical strips.
Those thin windows may have given the facade a softness, but that's not why they were there.
The architect, Minoru Yamasaki, was very nervous about heights. Amazingly, for the man who designed what were then the tallest buildings in the world, so he set these window widths at 22, 23 inches so that they would not be wider than his own shoulders, so he couldn't imagine himself falling through.
For New Yorkers, it was a Frenchman named Philippe Petit who helped turn the buildings from eyesores to icons.
This morning, several thousand workers in the financial district were unable to take their eyes off a lone figure balanced precariously on a steel wire strung between Manhattan's two tallest skyscrapers.
Yes, I am the first person who, maybe the only one, who actually made the Twin Towers look human by walking and, you know, promenading between them.
And then when George Willig did the second amazing thing of climbing up the building, suddenly these people brought life to these buildings that seemed so inanimate, seemed so devoid of life.
And in the process made them popular, a subject and eventually a home for artists. One of the artists who worked on the 92nd floor died on September 11th. His last work, a memorial to the World War II Tuskegee Airmen, a sculpture of his own body pierced by airplanes. And what about the memorial to the thousands who died in the towers?
People care very much about rebuilding. They also care very much about the sacred, hallowed nature of this ground, and they want a way in which both of these things can happen.
Mayor Giuliani created some controversy this week when he suggested the entire 16-acre site become a memorial.
We should think about a soaring, monumental, beautiful memorial that just draws millions of people here to just want to see it.
Paul Goldberger says there is room for both a memorial and office buildings.
I would love to see a huge tower, maybe just a broadcast tower and observation tower, not a habitable tower, but a New York's Eiffel Tower. What better way to honor them than by putting back the tallest thing in America to that piece of land? What greater response to what happened?
But it will likely be a long and contentious discussion before ground is ever broken on any memorial. And maybe that's the best tribute for the buildings themselves, that those two towers which were welcomed with so little enthusiasm should be mourned with such passion. That's our report.
A new team of federal security managers, supervisors, law enforcement officers, and screeners will ensure all passengers and carry-on bags are inspected thoroughly and effectively.
Now, it seems as though there was only one story this year, but we take time now to tell you about many you may have forgotten.
May God bless our new president and our new vice president, and may God bless the United States of America.
We will never get over this.
So help me God.
Congratulations. Pardoning a fugitive from justice.
is wrong.
Former President Clinton is strongly denying that political contributions influenced his decision to pardon fugitive billionaire Mark Rich.
I spent a lot of time on that case. I think there are very good reasons for it.
In Washington, D.C., police cadets continue to comb the city's wooded areas this morning looking for signs of Chandra Levy.
Why won't you take a polygraph?
Gary Condit's days in Congress may be numbered.
You got to tell the truth. I don't think there's anyone in Washington, D.C. who's been more cooperative in this investigation than myself.
Robert Hansen worked at the heart of the FBI's operation.
He just seemed like a regular person.
All the while, the FBI charges he was also passing secrets to the Russians.
They believed he had done, as someone put it this morning, a hell of a lot of damage to the United States.
Timothy James McVeigh has been executed by lethal injection.
Witnesses say that McVeigh showed no sign of remorse.
This man clearly deserved what he got. He died peacefully, which I cannot say my 3 members of my family did.
Slobodan Milosevic is handed over to an international tribunal.
They would regard Milosevic as the big fish, finally, the big kahuna that they finally have their hooks into.
The specific charges include ordering the massacre of hundreds of ethnic Albanians.
Former Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic was formally charged with committing genocide during the war in Bosnia.
I consider this tribunal false tribunal and indictments false indictments.
A powerful earthquake in northwest India, 7.9 on the Richter scale.
And based on the number of people missing, Indian officials believe that 20,000 may have died.
The numbers don't nearly tell the story of the damage, the grief, and the fear.
Nepal's prime minister is promising an investigation into the massacre of the country's royal family. Officials say the nation's crown prince killed his mother and father and 6 other relatives.
Foot and mouth is the most contagious disease among animals or humans.
3.7 million animals destroyed across England.
We must carry it on until the disease is fully eradicated.
100 lambs are just slaughtered and 50 calves.
It was the worst terrorist attack here in 5 years. The victims were mostly teenagers.
Israel attacked Palestinian positions in Gaza overnight.
The 2 Hamas suicide bombers chose a pedestrian mall.
Palestinians say no Israeli strike will go unavenged, and that makes for a cycle of violence with no end in sight.
Hope is quickly fading that any more survivors will be found from a Japanese fishing boat split in 2 by a U.S. submarine off Hawaii.
This collision was solely the fault of USS Greenville.
Deeply sorry about the accident that took place. Our nation is sorry.
On Hainan Island, a U.S. spy plane, a crew of 24 Americans in Chinese hands.
It is time for our servicemen and women to return home.
No apology, but a formal statement of regret. That's the latest message from the White House to Chinese leaders.
It has been a very long journey, but 24 American servicemen and women are finally home tonight.
The political and ethical minefield of stem cell research using human embryos.
I've concluded that we should allow federal funds to be used for research on these existing stem cell lines.
A devastating week for Wall Street.
All 3 of the major stock indexes plunged.
The Fed cut interest rates for the 11th time this year.
7 million Americans are now out of work.
Well, a recession is official for the first time in a decade.
Congress passed the largest tax cut in a generation.
You light a time bomb today that will blow up for generations yet to come.
Power blackouts, brownouts could be coming to a neighborhood near you.
California is clamoring for cheaper power. Gas prices are going up.
The fall of Enron, the biggest bankruptcy in history.
Enron collapsed after overstating its profits by more than $1 billion.
I trusted the management of Enron with my life savings. They betrayed that trust.
Enron executives sold $1 billion worth of stock when it was at its height.
It is 2 months and a day since the trade towers were attacked, and now an American Airlines flight had crashed into a New York neighborhood.
People who lived here were on the ground when the plane hit.
All information we have currently is that this is an accident.
That it may have been just an accident is no relief to those who lost a loved one.
But this is how we will remember 2001. And this is why many of us are glad to see this year end. Still, the story stays with us. 3.5 months after September 11th, the recovery work at the site of the once mighty Twin Towers continues around the clock and will likely continue through much of 2002.
It's already 2002 in many parts of the world. Celebrations over Sydney's harbor in Australia. The traditional lion dancing in Taiwan. Some impressive fireworks in the Chinese city of Shenzhen. Celebrations in Moscow and more fireworks in New Zealand's largest city, Auckland.
All I know is that he's running. And anytime you get a person running, it means you're going to get him pretty soon.
If you take a look at the new Euro bills you're looking at, these bills have all kinds of new anti-counterfeit technology. A hologram with multiple threads of metal, strange squiggles, minuscule orange dots, and here, you see half of the number